Okay.
So I think that what we want to look at is a little bit of basically where the county council and the voters kind of came to, right? So I think one of the main directives that you look at with respect to the bond is, first and foremost, we're going to do 5 million and we're going to see how that 5 million goes. And I think part of it, if I understand it, and please, county council members, jump in if I get this wrong, but part of what we're talking about in terms of where we're going to go with the $5 million and whether we're going to authorize another $5 million comes down to this element that I will call leveraging. And then if you want to talk about leveraging, you've got to talk about funding. So again, stop me at any moment.
Well, let me stop you then.
Okay.
I think from the county council point of view, we want to set some criteria. This board needs to set some goals and criteria.
Right.
This is what we'd like to accomplish in within this first $5 million.
Yep.
And put that in some kind of written document to the county council so that when we go back to the other $5 million, we can say, hey, we've done this, we've accomplished this task.
Yep.
So they can see that there's progress being made and
Right.
it's just not a wish list.
Right. And Councilman Farrell, the reason that I bring up funding and leveraging is because I think that accomplishes the beginning of how we set our criteria.
Okay.
So I'm glad that you brought that up. And if I don't get there and you feel like what I'm talking about here,
I'll certainly tell you.
I count on it and I'm sure you will. Okay, so in terms of looking at leveraging and funding, let's come to a couple of things that we know for sure. You can get money from private foundations. You can get money from state resources. Talk about that in a minute. You can get money from the federal government, okay? Now, I'm not in favor of raising taxes or necessarily relying on the federal government, but the Farm Bill looks like it's going to pass, okay? And the Farm Bill includes money with NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, okay? Now, they have a program called ALE, or the Agricultural Land Easement Program. And right now, I think there are billions of dollars that are going into the Farm Bill, and some of those billions of dollars are going to end up in the ALE program. If we as a nation are paying for that from a taxpayer perspective, I think some of those monies should come to Wasatch County, and we can do that. So there's some of your funding right there. There's also community sources. And I think I want to identify for folks that when you get to this place with community sources, why would people who are already spending money on the bond put money into this? Because there are some people who need a tax deduction. There are some people who really care about these issues. And in addition to the $19.97 per year that they're paying in Wasatch County to get open space, they might be willing to contribute $100, $1,000, $500,000, I don't know, but we're not going to discount them just because we've also passed a bond. We've done that in other communities and made sure that we've been able to leverage those dollars. So you have all of these other sources of funding, and I think that I would put a big equals sign under here, because since you have a local source of funding, you have the ability to really leverage that and go after these funds. So again, coming back to Councilman Farrell's point, how is this going to help us set criteria? All of these entities already have criteria. So what I would challenge all of you, oh, I forgot one. There's also the tax deduction that a landowner can take a deduction for under 170H, and Councilman Farrell is nodding because he understands how this works as well. All of these sources, aside from the community sources, have criteria already set forth. And I dare say that the community sources are going to basically say, if you can't meet the criteria in some of these other programs, have we created a transparent process under which we are moving forward? So if you look at, and I'm going to start with the tax deduction element, because basically all of these, in fact, NRCS, you cannot get NRCS funding unless you've satisfied primarily what you have under 170H. There are a few nuances, a few tweaks on that, but basically you have to satisfy all of those criteria. So first and foremost, what kind of land are we looking to protect? And I think you can prioritize. So I want to say that again, you can prioritize what kind of lands you're looking at. But let's again come down to, hey Justin, let's come down to what exactly are the criteria that we have here. Well, one, we have public, education, or recreation. And these are not in any specific order. I want to make that clear. Just because this is one doesn't mean this is number one. This is my favorite one. In part because I can't really spell it. A clearly delineated government policy. Oh, I get that. That's the piece down the road. What is a clearly delineated government policy? Clearly delineated government policy in Utah, we have the Farmland Assessment Act. We also have various communities that have enacted their own ordinances. In fact, Councilman Farrell was very instrumental in working towards a revamp of the
Urban Farm Bill.
Thank you. The Urban Farm Bill.
Which we got to do again.
Which, okay, let's do it. Because the clearly delineated government policy basically includes farmland and includes even forest land or lands that might have a heritage value if that's something that you've identified as a community. So we'll come up with these criteria, but I would say that back to the council members here, you may find that you want to adopt some sort of ordinance that also more formally, clearly delineates the policy that you're looking at in terms of what you'd like to protect. I know that Midway has just gone through their master planning process and they put their chapter of open space together. That's one way that you can do it, but you can also just basically do an ordinance, because what we're trying to protect for your specific community is specific to your community, and you can actually help out with that particular element. There's just the open space or the scenic value. And I like to say that farms are pretty scenic. I don't know a person that doesn't like to drive by a farm field that has cattle or horses that raise their head as you drive home. I mean, that is a scenic value that you see. And in addition to that, especially when you're looking at Wasatch County, if you come, drive along and you're looking across this pastoral setting to the mountains, which we think is really a value in our community, if that was blocked by high rises, you wouldn't see those mountains. You would have an impaired scenic quality. Okay. So then the fourth is, and this is I'm paraphrasing all of these things, but basically wildlife habitat or a natural feature. Wetlands qualify under this. Does the 10 acres that is behind somebody's home qualify as wildlife habitat? Probably not. It has to be substantial and significant wildlife habitat. There are a lot of ways to look at that. Part of it is if you're protecting this piece over here and this piece adjacent to it, you might start to have wildlife habitat that is more significant. But don't hang your hat on wildlife habitat if you're protecting an acre of ground behind someone's house. That is not what this is talking about. And if you look into the code and you look for the reference and you look at the court cases, you will see that it isn't just the acre of ground because every once in a while a deer comes into my house and eats my vegetation. That is not considered wildlife habitat, although many of us feel like it is. But that's another value.
What about my 4 children? They're kind of like animals.
They are. And if you could get a clearly delineated policy and then you could also wrap it into recreation, I think we might have something for you. I like that. The fifth
that wasn't
one,
on the record, was
yeah, it is. It's,
and you love those children.
I love
See? You see how that works out? I know how they are. And so, and then the historic value. So if there's a historic designation in a particular area, even if it's not necessarily a structure. On the East Coast, they've preserved battlefields that have a historic designation to them. This one is a little bit harder from all of the various different values. So when you're looking at the criteria, If the land that you're protecting falls within these criteria, you've kind of met this first kind of threshold that you have in terms of what you're looking at from a funding perspective. And I also think that you've also created that first, I'm going to call it a litmus test, right? We understand what a litmus test is. If you're looking at the transparency of the process, well, why didn't you pick my property? My property is the best. Okay. How many of these values did your property satisfy? So from that perspective, I think one of the things that's really important to look at is what you need to look at in terms of creating your criteria is a criteria that identifies what are the values that are important to you as a community. And if you rank, and I'm saying this because I think this may be a key in Wasatch County, if you rank open space and scenic values, which could include that farmland, and you rank a clearly delineated government policy, which is the importance of protecting self-sufficiency in farmland in your community, these might very well be some of your higher priority pieces. So you could even say, we're going to give 5 points here, 10 points here, 10 points here, 5 points here, 1 point here. And the first part of what you look at in terms of your criteria is, well, gosh, if a project comes in and it has this and this and this, it's already got 15 points when you start out.
25.
I meant, because of the math that I do so well, 25 points. Thank you. And the other one only had 6. At least I got that right. So, so that's how you can start to play with the criteria. But I suggest, if you do all of this, you're going to potentially qualify here. You have to definitely have this, or sorry, you definitely have to have this. You have to have that agricultural value if you want to go for NRCS. If you want to go for the state, you can have any of those. And if you want to go for private foundation funding, it really depends. Some private funders really care about this. Some private funders really care about this. So you will be able to qualify for some of these. But I think the next part that I think is really important in your criteria process comes back to this word. And it relates to this. If you look at the federal funding under the Agricultural Land Easement Program and some of the things that they've just actually enacted in the Farm Bill, more and more the feds are saying that actual contributions from the landowners when it comes to the value of these conservation easements, actually they're counting more and more of that value. So for example, part of what you might want to put into your criteria is, here's all of the things that qualify. Okay, are you with me? These are all things that qualify for potential funding. But we have limited dollars. So the projects that come in that meet more than one of these criteria, you're going to get more points. Then we have a second tier of criteria, or maybe it's the first tier. I don't know how you want to work it, but then you have another tier of criteria, which is basically comes down to, do you have matching funds? Now, a lot of landowners that might come in and might apply and say, I want to do a conservation easement, or I want to get funding from the open space bond for my particular property, they may just come in on their own. But some of them might come in on their own, and they might come in and they might say, I've looked at my finances and I've looked at where my family is at, and we want to keep farming. In fact, we want to do it for generations after generations. And we think that if we could get 50% of the value of our land, of the conservation easement, if we could get 50% of the value of our conservation easement, that we could make it work. So, because clearly I'm not good at math, okay? If we just used a round number of $1 million, let's say the conservation easement is worth $1 million, and the landowner comes in and he says, I'm going to give you $500,000. you've already leveraged some of that $5 million. But now let's say, well, let's keep the 50%. Now let's say the landowner comes in and he says, I'm willing to do 50% of the conservation easement because I'm going to take a tax deduction because I fit under one of these criteria from 170H. Okay, great. But here's the next thing. I have talked to, well, since I'm here, Utah Open Lands, and they're going to come up with 25% of my project.
25% of the total project, or 25% of his 50%?
25% of the cost after he's donated the 50%. So right here,
125 grand.
if you look at this, yeah. And well, no. If you look at this, right, so this is 75% of the $1 million. So now, instead of paying $500,000, the county's only paying $250,000. And maybe we've leveraged it through this program, NRCS. Or maybe we've leveraged it because we've gotten private funding. Utah Open Lands testified in front of the legislature in October, and we asked for $2 million to go into the Leroy McAllister Fund. Currently, the governor's budget includes an appropriation for $2.6 million into the Leroy McAllister Fund. That's great. That may be money that we can leverage.
That fund has been dry, hasn't it? For the
It has. In fact, they were looking at disposing of that fund last year. And so now it looks like there might be some funding, and hopefully we'd be able to build on that year after year. So the other thing, if you look at this NRCS program, in some instances, NRCS will pay 75% of the value of the land. Typically, what NRCS requires is a 50% match. So the same landowner that comes in and says he's going to give 50% of the conservation easement could come in and say, and I've got 50% match from NRCS. In that case, he'd be done. What NRCS typically requires is a 25% match. So in that particular instance, again, you've leveraged it again. You've got 25% coming in from the landowner, 50% coming in from NRCS. And again, you're back to the same 25% that the county is coming into. And so I guess what I am looking at is you have these, oh, one last thing. The state will only pay under Leroy McAllister 50% of the total project costs. You're going to be competitive when you go to Leroy McAllister because there are going to be a lot of other entities and landowners and counties that are applying for this funding. So the more that you can knock this down to only asking them for 25% or 10%, right? The better chances you have of getting the state fund. But this is my point. A lot of these funding sources require matches. So you're not going out on a limb to set as part of your criteria that you are looking for projects that will create matching funds. Or, in other words, the way I like to say it, if you're willing to give 25, 50, whatever percentage of the property value as a match from a donation value that you're going to get under the tax deduction scenario, you go to the head of the class. You may have some of these values, but if you're also willing to make a contribution, it makes it easier for us to apply to some of these sources. There are a lot of these sources out there that can leverage that funding. Even just simply the tax deduction itself can help leverage that funding. Does that make sense? So I come back to, I think, Councilman Farrell, where you were coming from in terms of how do you establish those criteria. My suggestion to the committee, my strong suggestion to the committee, is to identify what you're looking at. You can even prioritize within this criteria, this level of criteria, and there's more flowery ways to say it than what I've said here. But you can even prioritize within that. But then I also think that part of your criteria should be two things. One, how much of a match are you getting? Even if the landowner's getting 100% of the value of the conservation easement, if they're getting 50% of a match from NRCS or Utah Open Lands or some other entity, then at the end of the day, you're leveraging your dollars. And so I don't think it's out of line for you as a open space board to say part of our criteria also relies on this. And then the second part of the criteria, after you get through this and you get through that, or I guess it's the third part of the criteria, is a multiplier of values. Not every property needs to have public recreation and education. And in fact, we all know that there's a lot of agriculture that doesn't mix with public recreation. But there's a lot of agriculture, as farmers will tell you, where they're feeding wildlife, where they are, in essence, the winter habitat, the critical winter range for wildlife habitat. So I think if you set as a criteria that you'd like to have more than one of these 5 values met to kind of raise your rankings, I think that's good. So how would the rankings work? Well, there's one of the ways that you could kind of look at it is that you start off basically with, your number 1 criteria, X amount of points, right, for meeting the conservation value test. Let's just say that that's what that is, because that's what that is. It's the conservation values or the conservation purpose test. Your second, you get X amount of points for the number of conservation values on your property. The third, you get X amount of points for matching funds. The fourth might be an idea for you. The fourth, because it is also a criteria that some of these other funding sources have. The fourth might be the threat of development. And this is a tricky one based on some of the things that you sent me in terms of questions. So when we talk about the threat of development, we are not talking about what I think I might be able to develop my property at. Okay, we're not talking about if I go in for a zone change. We are not talking about, but this is what I want to develop on my property. We are talking about what is the current developable ability of this particular property. And in that particular instance, I can tell you right now, you're going to have some challenges, because if you can only develop 1 unit per acre and you're saving an acre of ground and you've already developed 1 unit.
There's nothing there.
Exactly. So that, I think, is also a criteria that can be used. And I think the reason to use it is a number of reasons. One, it is something that NRCS pays attention to. They do look at the developability of the property and what the threat is, because obviously if you are taking out 500 homes as opposed to 20 homes, you have protected more value potentially, depending on all of those things. So that is something that I think is definitely part of the criteria, that again, you can identify X amount of points.
Wendy, can you help me understand the difference between 1 and 2? They seem to, at a minimum, sort of cover the same ground.
Yes, they do, you would think. But here's my point on that. You are going to have people that will apply to you that do not have any conservation values. They're not farming it. It doesn't have prime farmland soil. It's not irrigated. It's a steep slope. am I saying too much? It's a steep slope, it's undevelopable or whatever. It's only 10 acres, it's surrounded by development, but I want you to protect the wildlife habitat on it. Okay, well, we look at this test, doesn't meet that, doesn't meet the wildlife habitat.
So 0 points.
So 0 points on the conservation values. My point is, you might have somebody who comes in and says, you know, I have this piece of farm ground, and it's a clearly delineated government policy, but nobody can see it. Okay, so it's 10 acres, again, because of my math. I'm glad you pointed that out earlier, because it's not my strong suit. So you've got 10 acres, and it's irrigated land, and it's agriculture, and we have a clearly delineated government policy that says we want to protect agriculture, and that's it. Nobody can see it. It's surrounded by a subdivision. There's no wildlife habitat there, and we're not going to allow public recreation. But it does fit in with our criteria of clearly delineated government policy.
It's a dairy farm, so it's not scenic.
I don't know. I mean, dairy farms can be scenic. You know.
Some, the ones in Idaho are. The ones here are actually quite nice.
Depends. It depends on your dairy farm, I guess. But again, right? So it doesn't. Nobody in the scenic test. If you get into the scenic test, it has to be seen from like 40
From somewhere.
or the Alpine Scenic Loop sort of thing. I mean, it can't just be Cortland's got a backyard that happens to be a farm, and he's the only one who sees it, and he thinks it's valuable. Of course he does. But Justin can't see it, and Tracy, and Councilman Farrell, and so so my point with 1 and 2, the difference is, then comes the farmer who says, I got 10 acres, it's irrigated farmland, it hits the clearly delineated government policy, it's on I-40 or it's visible from I-40, and I'm feeding a bunch of elk or deer because it's adjacent to URMCC property. Yeah, you start going down, so all of a sudden he gets bing, 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 he gets 3 points because he's, or however you do that. Not going to get into points, but do you see where, that's why I think there is a difference between the
I guess
two.
it's conflating, because so what you're saying in step 1 is you just give it a point for just hitting the test at all.
Yes,
And then in
because there
step
will be
2,
some,
step 2, you're going to give them like bonus points
if they hit more
if
than
they
one.
hit more than one. Okay.
And the only reason I say that, Justin, is way too often, how do I say this? You want to be able to kind of chuck the ones that don't even.
Yeah, if they don't hit any of the goals.
They may want to protect
Criteria.
their property, but if they can't meet one of the requirements, you're going to have a hard time funding it.
Sure.
You're going to have a hard time passing, why is this valuable to the public in general?
And it could do us damage in the public eye.
I think that's a key element. So again, if it meets one of them, you want to consider it. But if it meets more than one, let's
Okay.
that's kind of where I'm going from that perspective. Does that make sense?